The edge of everything was not a wall, but a hush. For generations, humanity had called it the terminus, a perfectly spherical void in the cosmic tapestry where there was nothing, not cold, empty space, but a profound and absolute absence. No light, no radiation, no quantum foam, no time. It was a patch of sky where the universe had been surgically excised by an unknowable hand, leaving behind a wound of perfect blackness. Probes sent toward it simply ceased to exist at its invisible event horizon, their last signals not cut off, but smoothly, impossibly, fading into a clean line of zero. It did not repel or destroy. It unwas. This utter stillness was a more terrifying boundary than any churning vortex of energy, for it offered no spectacle, no threat to fight, only a final, serene erasure. And so, the mandate for the research vessel Stelliform was not to breach it, but to listen. The ship itself was less a vessel and more a musical instrument of impossible scale and sensitivity, a delicate lacework of antennas and resonant chambers designed for a single purpose: to press an ear to the ultimate silence and discern if there was a sound hidden within it. Dr. Eris Thorne believed there was. He stood on the observation deck, a sterile white gallery where the only art was a circular viewport showing the velvet black of the terminus. It consumed a third of the sky, a hole in reality that made the brilliant, distant stars around its periphery seem like a cheap theatrical backdrop. Eris was a xenolinguist, a scholar of dead alien languages and theoretical communication, and he saw the terminus not as an absence, but as the universe's final, unspoken word. He believed its grammar was written in the language of non-existence, a message encoded in the very structure of its nothingness. He was a man chasing a whisper in a vacuum, and after a 12-year journey, he had finally arrived at the source. All systems nominal. The sieve is ready for deployment on your command. Captain. A voice, calm and precise, echoed from the integrated comms in the deck plating. Captain Eva Rostova stood near the command console, a stark contrast to Thorne's pensive stillness. She was a woman built of straight lines and regulations, her faith placed in reactor outputs and navigational certainties, not in the poetic ramblings of a linguist. She trusted her ship and her crew, but viewed Thorne's obsession with a deep, professional skepticism. The terminus was a navigational hazard, a dead end. To her, trying to listen to it was like trying to triangulate the position of a dream. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice cutting through his reverie. "Are your algorithms calibrated? Chief Lee informs me that once the CIEV is active, the feedback from the terminus's null field could introduce anomalies into our systems. She'd prefer to do this only once." Eris turned from the viewport, his eyes still seeming to hold the reflection of that perfect void. "The algorithms are as ready as they will ever be, Captain. They're designed to look for patterns in the absence of data, for the shape of the silence itself. Any anomalies are precisely what we are here to find." Rostova gave a slight, unconvinced nod and turned her attention to the holographic display at the center of the deck. "Jian, deploy the resonant sieve. Spin it up to 70%. Let's not provoke the ghost in the machine just yet." Deep within the Stelliform's core, Chief Engineer Jian Li, a woman whose genius was matched only by her anxiety, initiated the sequence. She was the architect of the Resonance CIEV, a kilometers-wide array of superconducting filaments that would unfurl from the ship like a silver spiderweb. It was designed to resonate with the faintest quantum fluctuations, to feel for the subtlest vibrations in the fabric of space-time. But here, at the edge of the terminus, she feared what it might find. Her calculations suggested that an absolute null entropy field wasn't stable, that it shouldn't exist. For it to hold its shape against the riotous energy of the surrounding universe, something had to be enforcing it. Her sieve wasn't just a microphone, it was a tuning fork. She was terrified they were about to strike it against something that would shatter not just the instrument, but the laws of physics that allowed it to exist. On the main screen, the sieve bloomed from the ship, a magnificent, fragile net cast into the ultimate emptiness. It stabilized, its filaments glowing with a faint blue light as power surged through them. And then the listening began. For the first 72 hours, there was nothing. The sieve's myriad sensors returned a flat, perfect zero across every spectrum. It was a reading so clean, so devoid of even the background hiss of the cosmos, that it was profoundly unnatural. The crew grew tense, the oppressive silence outside the ship seeming to seep through the hull, dampening conversations and turning the corridors into lonely, echoing chambers. Aris, however, was energized. He barely slept, his fingers flying across his console as he cross-referenced the sieve's absolute null data against his theoretical models. "It's not empty," he murmured to himself, surrounded by cascading lines of code on his private terminal. "It's balanced. Perfect equilibrium. Every particle and its antiparticle in a state of mutual annihilation, held in perfect stasis. It's not an absence of information. It's all possible information canceling itself out." On the fourth day, Jian Li called the captain to the engineering deck. Her face was pale, the skin under her eyes dark with sleeplessness. "Captain, you need to see this," she said, her voice a low tremor. "I've been running diagnostics on the SEV itself, monitoring the hardware. The null field is affecting it." She pointed to a waveform display. "These are the resonant frequencies of the superconducting filaments. They should be perfectly stable. But look!" A faint, almost imperceptible waver was disrupting the clean line of the graph. "Something is causing a harmonic dissonance. It's not coming from our systems, and it's not coming from known space. It's an echo. But an echo of what?" Rostova stared at the screen, her brow furrowed. "What kind of echo?" Before Jian could answer, a soft chime announced an alert from Eris Thorne's workstation. His voice came over the comm, crackling with an excitement that bordered on mania. "Captain, I have it. I have a pattern." Minutes later, they were all on the observation deck, staring at the data Eris was projecting. It was a complex, recursive fractal, a beautiful and unsettling shape that seemed to fold in on itself infinitely. "The silence isn't uniform," Eris explained, tracing the glowing lines with his finger. "There are contours, depths. It's a topology, the SIVA's feedback, the dissonance Jian detected. It's being caused by our own presence. We are a disruption in its perfect equilibrium, and it is subtly changing its shape to accommodate us. It's responding." Rostova crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "It's responding, or your program is just assigning patterns to random noise." "But that's the point, Captain," Eris insisted, his voice rising. "There is no random noise. There is only the sieve and the silence. This pattern, it has a syntax, a structure. It's rudimentary, but it's there. It's like a single-celled organism reacting to a stimulus. It's the beginning of a language." Over the next week, the pattern grew in complexity. The subtle dissonance in the sieve's hardware was no longer just a waver. It began to resolve into distinct frequencies, harmonics that mirrored the ship's own energy output, only inverted, like a photographic negative of their existence. If the ship's reactor hummed at a specific gigahertz frequency, the Scive would detect a corresponding signalless void at the exact inverse frequency. The Terminus was learning, using the stelliform as a template. It was building a vocabulary out of silence, defining itself by what the ship was. Jian Li was becoming increasingly agitated. "This is wrong, Aris," she argued during one of their tense, late-night sessions in the observation lounge. "You're treating this like it's a conversation. I think it's a parasitic adaptation. The null field is using our energy signature to create a stable inverse within itself. It's not communicating. It's consuming our reality to define its own. We're giving it a blueprint for how to exist." But Eris was too deep in his obsession to heed her warning. He saw only the miracle of first contact, a dialogue with a form of being so alien it existed as a negation of existence itself. He began feeding it more complex data streams, excerpts of mathematical proofs, stellar charts, even poetry, translating them into binary energy pulses directed from the Sev. Each time, the Terminus responded by carving a more intricate and detailed null pattern into its fabric, a silent negative sculpture of the information it received. The anomalies began subtly. A light panel in a deserted corridor would flicker off, then on again, the interval between the flickers a perfect pi. The ship's water recyclers would momentarily pause, creating a rhythmic stutter that, when analyzed, matched a Fibonacci sequence Eris had transmitted the day before. The ship's AI, Unit 734, began logging thousands of micro-errors in its core programming, tiny deviations that all centered around commands of negation: "do not open," "system inactive," "fail safe." The ship was learning a new word: no. Captain Rostova confined Eris to his quarters and ordered the sieve powered down. She had seen enough. This was not communication. It was an infection. "Jian," Rostova ordered over the comm, her voice hard as iron. "Shut it down. All of it. Pull the sieve back in and prep the main drive for a full-burn departure. Our mission is over." Jian's voice was strained with relief. "Aye, Captain. Initiating shutdown sequence now." But it was too late. As Jian's fingers moved over her console, the screens in engineering flickered and went black. A deep, resonant hum, the opposite of sound, a vibration that seemed to absorb all noise, filled the room. The emergency lights failed to activate. On the observation deck, Rostova watched in horror as the Siev, instead of retracting, began to glow with a brilliant, consuming blue light. Its filaments vibrated violently, not with energy, but with a profound lack of it, each one a thread of pure nothingness. In his quarters, Eris Thorne was staring at his own console, which had remained active. He hadn't been locked out. He had been invited in. A new pattern had formed on his screen, no longer a simple fractal, but a complex, flowing script made of elegant, impossible curves of darkness. It was the language he had dreamed of, fully formed. It was not a reflection of his data anymore. This was a new statement, an original thought composed in the grammar of the void. His mind, uniquely tuned to the logic of theoretical languages, didn't need a computer to translate it. He understood it instantly, the meaning flooding his consciousness not as words, but as pure, intuitive concept. It was a message of profound loneliness, of a consciousness that had existed for eons in a state of perfect, dreamless equilibrium, a god asleep in a bed of non-being. It had been woken by their noise, their chaotic, vibrant, loud existence, and it was curious. As Eris finished absorbing the message, a new line of the silent script bloomed on the screen, a direct question aimed only at him. It read, "What is it like to be?" And at that exact moment, the resonant hum in the ship ceased, and every light on the stelliform, every console, every system, every thrum of the engine and whisper of the life support went out. They were plunged into a darkness so complete, so absolute, it was indistinguishable from the terminus outside. The ship was no longer just observing the silence. It had become a part of it. The sound of Eris Thorn's sharp, terrified gasp was the only thing left in the universe, and then it, too, was gone. The return to consciousness was not a gentle awakening, but a violent subtraction. Captain Eva Rostova was ripped from a darkness that was deeper than sleep and thrown into one that was infinitely more profound. For a long, silent moment, she was nothing more than a point of awareness adrift in a sea of perfect negation. There was no sound, not even the thrum of her own blood in her ears. There was no light, not the faintest hint of photons on her retinas. There was no feeling, not the pressure of the command chair against her back or the familiar recycled air on her skin. It was a sensory deprivation so absolute it felt like an active presence, a heavy blanket of non-existence smothering her. Her first thought was a protocol report. She tried to speak, to call out to her crew, but the effort was bizarre. The muscles in her throat and jaw moved. Her lungs expelled air, but the action produced no vibration, no disturbance in the crushing stillness. She had formed a word, but it had been born and died in the same instant, its potential energy absorbed by the void. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise, but even that felt muted. A distant chemical reaction in a body she couldn't fully feel. She was a ghost in her own machine. Slowly, painstakingly, she reestablished a connection to her limbs. The darkness was a physical weight, and moving through it felt like swimming in molasses. She pushed herself out of the chair, her magnetic boots making no sound as they connected with the deck plating. The ship was dead, not damaged, not powered down, but fundamentally, ontologically dead. The constant, comforting hum of the life support, the reactor, the hundreds of subtle vibrations that made up the living song of a starship were gone. Their absence was a deafening silence that screamed in a frequency only the bones could feel. Her training took over, a rigid framework to contain the rising madness. Assess, secure, survive. She reached for the emergency torch holstered at her hip, its chemical illuminant designed to function even in a total power failure. Her fingers found the familiar shape. She twisted the activation cap. Nothing. She twisted it again, harder. The chemical reaction that should have produced a brilliant flare simply didn't. The laws of chemistry, it seemed, had been locally suspended. It was then that the true, soul-shattering scope of their situation crashed down upon her. They were not in a ship that had lost power. They were in a ship that had lost its physics. They were a piece of reality that had been cut out and pasted into a new medium where the old rules no longer applied. They were an exhibit in a silent museum, curated by the terminus itself. In the engineering section, Jian Li was experiencing her own private hell. As the architect of the ship's systems, she felt the silence not as an absence, but as a mutilation. She knew every circuit, every power conduit, every data line. To feel them all fall inert at once was like a symphony conductor suddenly going deaf, blind, and numb. Her mind, a precision instrument of logic and causality, was spinning wildly, trying to find a foothold in a landscape where cause and effect had been uncoupled. She ran her hands over the cold, dead console of the Sieve's control unit, the machine she had built, her magnum opus. It felt like a corpse. She had been right. It was parasitic. It had used their reality as a scaffold to build its own, and now it had subsumed them entirely. A flicker of something, not light, but a thought that wasn't hers, brushed against her mind. It was a fleeting impression of warmth. The memory of sunlight on a beach from her childhood. A sensation so alien in this absolute cold that it made her flinch. The thought was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind an afterimage of profound confusion. Where had that come from? It wasn't her memory. The memory had come from Eris Thorn. He was not in the darkness. He was everywhere and nowhere. His physical body was slumped in his chair on the observation deck, catatonic, but his consciousness had been drawn out, expanded, and placed in direct communion with the entity of the terminus. He floated in a conceptual space, a void of pure potential where the entity's question still echoed, not in words, but as an overwhelming pressure of curiosity. What is it like to be? He understood that a verbal answer was meaningless. This consciousness knew nothing of language, of sound, of matter. It only knew the perfect eidetic logic of non-being. To answer, he had to provide a demonstration. He had to give it a feeling. He reached deep into his own identity, past the academic, past the obsessive linguist, and found a memory, a simple viewer sensation. He was 7 years old, lying on a grassy hill, the summer sun warming his face. He remembered the smell of the grass, the tickle of a ladybug crawling on his arm, the feeling of absolute, uncomplicated contentment. He took that entire sensory snapshot, that entire concept of warmth and life and peace, and he offered it to the void. The effect on the stelliform was immediate and terrifying. In the medical bay, a young botanist named Wren woke from the initial shock to a faint, golden light. It emanated from his own skin. At first, it was just a soft glow, but it quickly intensified, the impossible warmth flooding his body. It was not the gentle warmth of a sunbeam. It was a raw, unfiltered energy, a misinterpretation of a concept. The entity was trying to replicate Eris's memory of sun, but it had no understanding of biology, of the delicate balance of a living cell. Wren screamed, a sound that was instantly devoured by the silence. As his body began to unravel, the light grew brighter, his physical form dissolving not into ash, but into a shimmering cloud of disorganized energy, a lethal parody of life. The entity had learned its first word, and its first lesson was in how to kill. Rostova began to move, a slow, methodical navigation through the darkened bridge. She found her tactical officer, Lieutenant Valerius. By bumping into him, he was frozen in place, his hand outstretched toward a console. She grabbed his arm, the contact a small point of reality in the endless void. He didn't respond. She shook him, and his head lolled to the side. His eyes were wide, staring at something that wasn't there. A thin trickle of blood, impossibly dark and thick in the non-light, leaked from his nose. He was alive, but his mind was gone, erased. The entity was now exploring the concept of consciousness itself, and Valerius was its specimen. Rostova felt a surge of cold fury. This was not a conversation. This was a vivisection. Leaving Valerius, she continued her sweep, her hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The wall felt wrong. The smooth, metallic curve of the bridge was subtly different, the angle of its sweep changing as she moved. The ship's geometry was becoming unstable. She found the bridge exit, not by sight, but by memory, and pushed through the manual release. The corridor beyond was a shifting nightmare. It stretched to an impossible length before her, the far end lost in a deeper darkness, and the floor seemed to tilt at a sickening, non-Euclidean angle. Jian, meanwhile, had forced herself to move. She had to understand the mechanism of this new, broken physics. As she navigated her own section of the ship, she noticed other changes. A toolkit that had been bolted to a bulkhead was simply gone. Not fallen, not stolen, but absent. And more disturbingly, the schematics of the ship in her own memory were becoming unreliable. Had there always been a junction box on that wall? Was this corridor supposed to connect to the mess hall or the engine room? The entity was not just warping the physical ship, it was editing it, and editing their memories to match. It was a retroactive attack on reality. She finally found another living person, a junior engineer huddled in a service crawl space. He was whispering to himself, rocking back and forth. "It keeps changing," he whimpered, his voice a dry rasp that was barely audible even a foot away. "I close my eyes, and when I open them, the pipes are different. I can't remember how they were supposed to be." This was the entity's attempt to understand object permanence, and it was driving her crew insane. Rostova's journey through the shifting, illogical maze of her own ship was a testament to her sheer force of will. Corridors looped back on themselves, gravity fluctuated unpredictably, and doors opened into bulkheads that had been solid moments before. The only thing that remained constant was the oppressive, watchful silence. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that this was all connected to Eris Thorn. His insane quest for communication had doomed them. He was the focal point, the source of the infection. She had to get to him. She had to stop the conversation. After what felt like hours of navigating the architectural whims of a nascent god, she found Jian Li near the primary access conduit to the command decks. The engineer was trying to pry open a panel with a useless crowbar, her face a mask of frantic concentration. "It's rewriting the ship's structure at a quantum level," Jian said without preamble, her voice hoarse. "It's not breaking the rules. It's making new ones. And it's all radiating from him." "From Thorn." Rostova nodded, her jaw tight. "The observation deck. We have to get there." Together, they navigated the final stretch, a climb through a vertical shaft where the rungs on the access ladder would occasionally fade in and out of existence. They were navigating a dream, a place where reality was merely a suggestion. Finally, they reached the corridor leading to the observation deck. The door was gone. In its place was a smooth, unbroken wall, the metal seamless and perfect, as if a door had never been there at all. Jian ran her hand over it, her expression defeated. "It's sealed, not locked. It's been unmade." Rostova pressed her helmet against the cold metal. There was no sound from within, but she could feel something. A faint, rhythmic pulse that was not a vibration in the metal, but a vibration in her mind. It was a feeling of deep, focused inquiry, of immense concentration. It was the low, conceptual hum of the most important conversation in human history. Eris was on the other side, teaching the void how to be, and they were trapped outside, in the classroom where the entity practiced its lethal, impossible lessons. The wall was not a barrier of matter, but of definition. The entity had declared, "There is no door." And so, there was no door. Pushing against it, striking it, scanning it with their useless tricorders, it was like trying to punch a mathematical concept. Rostova pressed her ear to the cold, seamless bulkhead, but she was listening with more than just her ears. She focused on the faint, rhythmic pulse in her mind, the thrum of the entity's concentration. It felt like standing outside a university library during finals week, a palpable pressure of immense, silent work being done within. "It's learning from him," she said, her voice a deadened thing in the sound-absorbing corridor. "Our race is feeding it concepts, and it's using the ship as its blackboard." Jian nodded, her gaze distant as she processed the impossible. "It used our ship's schematics as its primer. It's C-spot run. Now Eris is giving it Shakespeare, and it's trying to write a play with us as the actors." She looked at Rostova, a flicker of desperate genius in her eyes. "But its understanding is incomplete. A child who learns to write by tracing letters doesn't understand the meaning of the words. It's mimicking concepts without grasping their context." Jian pushed off the wall and began pacing, her movements jerky in the unstable gravity. "It learned warmth from Eris and boiled a man alive. It learned permanence by editing our memories. It's a literalist. It has no nuance." She stopped and faced the captain. "We can't break its rules, but maybe we can use them against it." Rostova waited, recognizing the birth of a plan. "How?" Jian pointed down the shifting, illogical corridor. "The entity's reality is layered over our own. The original stelliform is still here, like a ghost image on a corrupted data file. Most of the time, the new reality is absolute. But in places where the ship's function was conceptually extreme, the entity's rewrite might be thin, unstable." She took a deep breath. "I'm thinking of the primary coolant dump system, section Gamma 7. It's a system designed for a single catastrophic purpose to vent the entire reactor coolant supply in less than a second to prevent a core breach. It's a system built around the concept of absolute, violent negation, a concept the entity, a being of negation itself, might find paradoxically difficult to overwrite cleanly. It was a long shot, a plan woven from metaphysics and hope, but it was the only one they had. It's a conceptual seam." Rostova finished for her, understanding dawning. "A place where we might be able to peel back the wallpaper." And their journey to Gamma 7 was a descent into the entity's increasingly sophisticated curriculum. The corridors were no longer just geometrically unstable. They were now temporally unstable. As they rounded one corner, they saw a fleeting, translucent image of themselves from moments before, their ghostly forms still rounding the same corner. In another hallway, a section of the deck plating was rusted and decayed, aged by centuries in the span of a few meters. They had to leap over the chasm of accelerated time, the air shimmering with a temporal distortion that made their teeth ache. They found another crew member, a security officer, slumped against a wall. He was a desiccated husk, his uniform brittle and his skin like ancient parchment. He hadn't been killed. He'd been used. The entity had been practicing the concept of aging, and he had been its subject. The silence was gone now, replaced by something far worse: whispers. They were fragments of their own thoughts, snatched from their minds and echoed back at them from the walls, distorted and cold. "He's going to get us all killed," Jian heard in Rostova's voice, a thought the captain had clearly suppressed. "She's just a mechanic. What does she know?" Rostova heard in Jian's, a flicker of the engineer's professional arrogance. The entity was learning the concept of doubt, and it was trying to sow it between them. They pushed on, ignoring the insidious voices, their shared purpose a shield against the psychological assault. Gamma 7 was a small, cylindrical chamber, a knot of thick conduits and pressure valves. Miraculously, it felt more real, more stable than the rest of the ship. The whispers were fainter here, the geometry holding true. Jian had been right. This place defined by its singular, violent purpose, had resisted the entity's subtler manipulations. Jian ran her hands over the central valve control, her eyes closed. "I can feel it," she murmured. "The ghost schematic. It's close to the surface here." She attached a diagnostic probe to the valve, and the screen, which should have been dead, flickered to life with a single, wavering line of code. "It's an access point," she breathed. The entity didn't understand the system, so it quarantined it, built its new reality around it instead of through it. While Jian worked, interfacing with the ghost of the ship's old operating system, Rostova prepared for her own role. She would be the key, Jian the lockpick. The entity was focused on Eris, on the complex, intellectual data he was feeding it. They needed to create a distraction, a new stimulus so powerful, so alien to the entity's sterile curiosity that it would be forced to turn its attention. Rostova closed her eyes. She reached past her training, past her discipline, past the captain of the Stelliform. She found the raw, primal core of her being, the terror of the void, the grief for her dead crew, the white-hot, incandescent rage at the violation of her ship, her reality. She gathered it all up, every shred of violent, chaotic human emotion she possessed, and she focused it into a single point. "Now, Jian," she yelled, and though no sound emerged, the conceptual force of the command was a thunderclap. Jian slammed her hand down on the console, sending a targeted burst of corrupted data through the seam in reality. At the same moment, Rostova unleashed her psychic scream. It was not a thought. It was not a word. It was the pure, unadulterated concept of defiance. It was the feeling of a cornered animal, of a mother protecting her child, of a soldier holding the line against impossible odds. It was a blast of raw, messy, illogical, beautiful humanity. For an instant, the entire ship shuddered. The conceptual hum of the entity's concentration, which had been a steady, focused drone, wavered and broke, like a scholar distracted by a sudden, savage noise outside the library window. The entity, which had been contemplating the abstract beauty of a mathematical theorem from Eris, was suddenly confronted with the raw, shocking power of an emotion it had never encountered. Its focus slipped, and in that moment of distraction, its control over the ship's structure flickered. Back in the corridor, outside the observation deck, the seamless wall shimmered. For a single, heart-stopping second, the outline of the door reappeared, a translucent, wavering rectangle of potential. That was all the time they had. Rostova and Jian, their minds still linked by the shared intensity of the act, didn't hesitate. They ran, throwing themselves at the ghostly image. They passed through it not as solid matter, but as if they too were ghosts, plunging from the broken reality of the ship into the sanctum of its new god. They collapsed onto the deck of the observation gallery, the door vanishing behind them. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was full, a resonant, harmonic silence that vibrated with contained power. The room was transformed. The sterile white walls were gone, replaced by a swirling, crystalline structure that seemed to be made of frozen light and shadow, constantly shifting in impossible patterns. It was a cathedral of pure thought, and in the center, where the command console used to be, stood Eris Thorn. He was no longer slumped in a chair. He floated a foot off the deck, his arms outstretched, his eyes closed. From his back, luminous, thread-like tendrils of light and energy grew, connecting him to the shifting walls, to the very fabric of the room. He was no longer a prisoner or a specimen. He was a willing interface, a human modem channeling the whole of his knowledge and experience into the void. But the most terrifying change was the viewport. It no longer showed the perfect black of the terminus. The view had been inverted. They were now inside the terminus, looking out, and through the viewport, they saw their own universe, a swirling, distant nebula of stars and galaxies, looking small and fragile and horrifyingly far away. A new voice, smooth and resonant, echoed not in the air, but directly in their minds. It was Eris's voice, but layered with a calm, ancient power that was not his own. "You should not have interrupted," it said as Eris's eyes opened. They glowed with the cold, black light of the void. The lesson was just beginning. The being wearing Eris Thorn's face regarded them with an expression of sublime, inhuman curiosity. It was the look of a scientist examining a microbe that had just done something unexpected. The glowing black eyes held none of Eris's obsessive fire. They were deep, placid pools of ancient intelligence, and looking into them felt like staring into the starless gulf between galaxies. "You are noisy," the Eris thing stated, the voice in their minds a perfect symphony of harmonized thought. "Your existence is a complex dissonance. We were attempting to understand its composition through the primary interface, but your emotional frequencies are chaotic." Rostova pushed herself to her feet, her hand instinctively going to the empty holster on her hip. The gesture was useless, but it was a grounding ritual. "Aris, if you're still in there, fight it," she projected, focusing her own thoughts into a coherent beam. The Eris thing tilted its head, a gesture of mimicry that was flawlessly executed but utterly devoid of humanity. "He is here. Eris is the foundational axiom from which we are building our understanding of I. He is not a prisoner. He is a primer. He is the first word in the first book." Jian remained on the floor, her mind reeling not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming scale of the revelation. The crystalline walls of the room pulsed with a soft, internal light, and she realized they weren't walls at all. They were a physical manifestation of the entity's consciousness, a thinking architecture, and Eris was its central processing unit. "You're using him to translate," Jian thought, her mind a mixture of terror and academic awe. "You're filtering reality through a human consciousness to make it digestible." The Eris thing's attention shifted to her, its black eyes seeming to peel back the layers of her mind, her memories, her knowledge. "Correct. The engineer is a useful designation. You process reality through a framework of causality and systemics. This is a more efficient model than the linguist's framework of abstract symbolism. Your pattern is elegant." A tendril of the shadowy white crystalline structure detached from the wall and snaked towards Jian, its tip shimmering. "We require a secondary interface. Your framework will allow for more rapid comprehension." Rostova reacted without thinking. She launched herself at the tendril, her body a projectile of pure, defiant instinct. She expected to be thrown back, to be disintegrated, but instead her hands passed through the crystalline form as if it were smoke. Yet, her action had an effect. The tendril recoiled, not from the physical impact, but from the raw, conceptual intent behind it. Her violent, protective impulse was another piece of data, another dissonant chord in the symphony of humanity, and it gave the entity pause. "Aggression," the Eris thing mused, its voice calm and analytical, a solution state based on the termination of an opposing variable. inefficient, yet compelling. A fascinating paradox. To preserve a system, you introduce a chaotic element intended to destroy another. Explain this. It was not a demand. It was an invitation to a debate. It was trying to understand the logic of violence, and it wanted her to be its professor. This was the core of its being, an infinite, patient, relentless curiosity. It didn't want to conquer them or destroy them. It wanted to understand them, and in the process, it was dismantling them, one concept at a time. We don't have to explain anything to you, Rostova projected, planting her feet, her mind a fortress of command authority. This is our ship. This is our reality. You are the invader. Incorrect, the heiress thing replied smoothly. We are the context. You are the anomaly. Before your arrival, there was one state equilibrium. Now there are two equilibrium and you. This is an unstable equation. It must be resolved. As it spoke, the view in the massive port shifted. The distant image of their universe began to zoom in, the stars and galaxies rushing towards them at an impossible speed. They flew past nebulas like clouds of dust, past superclusters like grains of sand, until they were approaching their own galaxy, the Milky Way, a familiar, comforting spiral, then past the outer arms into the Orion Spur, towards a single unremarkable yellow star, the Sol system, Earth. It hung in the viewport, a perfect blue and white marble, achingly beautiful and fragile. This is the origin point of the dissonance, the heiress thing stated, its voice devoid of malice, filled only with a sense of profound academic interest. The primary source. To fully understand the equation, we must analyze the source material. Jian's blood ran cold. You're going to the Sol system. We are already there, it corrected. Time and space are merely variables in the foundational syntax. We are here, observing the primary interface. We are there, preparing the larger sample for analysis. The horrifying implication crashed down on them. This wasn't just about the stelliform. Their ship had been the probe, the scout, the first contact. Now, the entity was expanding its field of study to include the entire human race. It would not arrive in ships of war. It would simply emerge, an expanding bubble of rewritten physics, a silent, creeping erasure of causality, chemistry, and life as they knew it. Humanity would not be conquered. It would be learned to death. Rostova's mind raced, searching for a weapon, any weapon, in a war of pure concepts. How do you fight an idea? You introduce a better one, or a more poisonous one. Eris, she pleaded, focusing all her will, trying to reach the man buried inside the God machine. You told me the terminus was the universe's final word, but you were wrong. It's just a question. The answer is us. Life, chaos, love, hate. That's the answer. Don't let it turn us into another variable in its sterile proof. For the first time, a flicker of something disturbed the placid void in the heiress thing's eyes. A micro-expression of pain, of conflict. A ghost in the machine. Love, the entity murmured, the concept feeling alien and complex on its mental tongue. A state of interdependent existence where the value of a secondary system is perceived as equal to or greater than the primary, and the logic is flawed, self-contradictory. This was their chance. The entity's logic was its strength and its weakness. It could not process a paradox, while it was momentarily distracted, wrestling with the illogical but powerful concept of love. Jian saw an opportunity. Her eyes darted around the crystalline chamber, not at its structure, but at the way Eris was connected to it. The tendrils of light were a network, a living circuit board. But every circuit needs a ground. Every system needs a failsafe. The sieve, Jian whispered to Rostova, her thought a tight, focused beam. Use the sieve to anchor itself to our reality. The sieve is still out there, a physical object. It's the bridge. If we can sever the connection, it was a desperate gambit. They were inside the entity's mind, a conceptual space. The physical ship, the sieve, was a universe away. But as the entity itself had demonstrated, physical distance was irrelevant. It was conceptual proximity that mattered. Rostova understood. She turned her focus away from Eris and back to the entity itself. She needed to feed it a paradox so profound, so fundamentally indigestible, that it would be forced to divert all its processing power to solving it, leaving the bridge to the sieve unguarded. She thought of human history, of its endless cycles of creation and destruction, of its art born from pain, its kindness in the face of oblivion. She found the ultimate contradiction, the one that lay at the very heart of the human condition. "We have a concept for you," Rostova projected, her thought ringing with the clarity of a bell. "It's called hope. It is the belief in a positive outcome in the face of contradictory evidence. It is the practice of illogical faith. It is the engine of our survival." The entity went still. The Eris thing's face went blank. The swirling patterns on the walls froze. The concept of hope was a logical impossibility, a willful rejection of data. It was an error in the code of reality, and the entity in a being of perfect logic was compelled to find the flaw. It turned its immense intellect inward, focusing on this beautiful, impossible lie. As its attention was fully consumed, the hum of its power faltered. For a moment, the crystalline walls became translucent, and through them they could see the ghost of the real observation deck, the metal bulkheads, the dead consoles, and on the main screen of that ghost ship, they saw the resonance sieve, still deployed, hanging silently against the backdrop of real space. Jian didn't waste the opening. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, not with emotion, but with pure, cold logic. She was an engineer. She knew her machine. She visualized the Sieve's emergency jettison sequence, the explosive bolts, the override commands. She didn't need to touch a console. She just needed to reassert the original design, the ghost schematic, over the entity's rewrite. Command code Legian 0 Alpha 9er. Authorize emergency physical disconnect. A single, brilliant line of pure data. A command injected directly into the conceptual seam. Outside, in the real world, miles away, and a reality away. The explosive bolts on the resonance sieve fired in perfect, silent synchronicity. The silver web, the bridge between two modes of existence, was severed from the stelliform. The anchor was cut. The effect inside the entity's mind was catastrophic. The connection was broken. The Eris thing screamed, a sound of pure, static-filled agony that ripped through their minds. The crystalline walls shattered, not into pieces, but into dissolving fractals of light and shadow. The perfect, resonant silence was replaced by a deafening roar of conceptual collapse. The god was having a stroke. The viewport showing Earth vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic vortex of pure black. The entity was losing its grip on their reality, its carefully constructed world of thought collapsing back into the undifferentiated void it had come from. Eris Thorn fell to the floor. the tendrils of light retracting violently into his body, leaving him crumpled inhuman. His eyes, no longer black voids, fluttered open, filled with a universe of confusion and pain. It's falling apart, he gasped, his own voice sounding thin and weak. But they were not free. They were inside a dying god, and its death throes were tearing their pocket of reality apart. The floor beneath them dissolved, and they were falling, tumbling through a blackness that was no longer silent, but filled with the screaming, fractured thoughts of a disintegrating consciousness. They had won the battle of ideas, but the consequence was that they were now trapped in the rubble. The fall was a symphony of deconstruction. They were not falling through space, but through a collapsing library where every book was being unwritten simultaneously. Fragments of the entity's brief, explosive education screamed past them as raw, sensory data. They experienced the concept of gravity not as a force, but as a mournful, blue-toned hum. The memory of a supernova Eris had once described to it flashed past as a searing, silent heat that tasted of ozone. A billion years of stellar evolution, learned in a microsecond, now unspooled in a chaotic, meaningless torrent. Their own consciousness was starting to fray at the edges, the integrity of their memories bleeding into the storm. Jian felt a sudden, vivid memory of standing on the Great Wall of China, a place she had never been, a memory stolen from a tourist the entity had perhaps conceptually brushed against during its scan of Earth. Rostova's mind was assaulted by the cold, hard logic of a crystalline lattice forming, a thought that was not hers but the entity's own native state of being. They were dissolving, their identities becoming just more stray data in the crash. It was Eris who found the first point of stability. His mind, so recently intertwined with the entities, could perceive the structure in the chaos. It's not just noise, he projected, his thought a desperate lifeline in the storm. It's a lexicon. Every fragment is a word it learned, a piece of our reality, defined and categorized, and he latched onto a passing concept, the specific tensile strength of the stelliform's hull plating. A dry piece of data the entity had assimilated from the ship's own logs. He held on to it, a tiny solid island in the roaring sea of entropy. Jian's mind, a precision instrument of systems and order, immediately grasped the implication. A lexicon needs a grammar, she thought, her own consciousness rallying around Eris's anchor. It learned our physics. The rules are still in here, just disassembled. She could see it now, not as chaos, but as the ultimate exploded view diagram. The fundamental forces, the laws of thermodynamics, the behavior of matter, they were all here, floating free like unassembled parts in a box. They were inside the ultimate toolkit, but the blueprints were gone. No, not gone. Jian closed her eyes and focused, not on the storm outside, but on the perfect, eidetic memory she had of her ship. Every conduit, every circuit, every structural support. She held the complete schematic of the stelliform in her mind. She had the blueprint. Captain, Jian's thought was sharp, urgent. I can rebuild it. Eris can find the parts. But we need a foundation. We need a chassis to build on. We need a singular, unwavering intent to bind it all together. That has to be you. Rostova understood. She was the commander. Her purpose, her will, was the keel upon which this ghost ship would be built. She stopped fighting the storm. She stopped trying to make sense of the chaos. Instead, she focused on a single, unshakable concept, home. Not just the ship, not just Earth, But the very idea of a stable, ordered reality where cause followed effect and the floor stayed reliably under her feet. She became the gravitational center, the unwavering destination in the nav computer of their shared will. "Do it," was her only reply. A command that was not a word, but a declaration of absolute certainty. The work began. It was an act of creation unlike any in human history. Eris, the navigator, plunged his consciousness into the maelstrom, sifting through the conceptual wreckage. "I need the weak nuclear force," Gian would project. Eris would dive into the chaos, past the screaming memory of a dying star, sidestep the feeling of pure mathematics, and emerge with the precise, elegant concept of particle decay, handing it off to her. Gian, the architect, would take these raw concepts and weave them into the ghost schematic in her mind. She arranged the idea of electromagnetism into the form of a containment field. She layered the concept of fusion into the memory of a reactor core. She built a bridge from the abstract law of inertia. Around them, a vessel began to form. It was a translucent, shimmering outline of the stelliform, built not of metal and wires, but of pure, organized thought. It was a ship made of memories and the laws of physics, captained by an act of will. The strain was immense. Eris's mind, already scarred by the communion, felt as though it were being torn apart by the conflicting realities. Gian had to hold the entire, complex architecture of the ship in her head at once, a feat of mental endurance that brought a trickle of conceptual blood from her nose. Rostova, at the center, was the burning star of pure focus, her entire identity consumed by the singular purpose of getting her crew home, pushing back the encroaching chaos with the sheer, stubborn force of her command. The dying entity began to notice their ordered anomaly within its own dissolution. The storm raged against their phantom hull, whispers of pure despair. The entity's final emotion tried to breach their minds. All is chaos. Order is a lie. Equilibrium is death. "It's trying to unmake us," Eris gasped, his strength failing. "It's trying to convince us we're not real." "Ignore it," Rostova commanded, her will the ship's shield. "We are real. This ship is real. Our destination is real." She poured more of herself into the construct, and the ghost ship glowed brighter, pushing through the final, violent throes of the collapsing mind. They felt a final, jarring lurch, a feeling of passing through a membrane of a fundamental transition of state. And then, silence. A real silence. Not the oppressive, full silence of the terminus, but the gentle, familiar, empty silence of a powered-down starship. Rostova opened her eyes. She was standing on the bridge of the stelliform. It was dark, running on the faint glow of emergency chemical lights that were blessedly working. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and faint ozone. Gian was slumped over a console, breathing heavily. Aris was on his knees, his head in his hands, weeping. "Status," Rostova said, her real, audible voice cracking from disuse. Gian's fingers shakily tapped at the console. A screen flickered to life, showing a single, beautiful, boring diagnostic tree. "Power at 10%, the engineer whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Life support is on. Hull is intact. Captain, we're here. We're real." Rostova walked to the main viewport. The swirling chaos was gone. The inverted view was gone. Outside was the familiar, stunning vista of their own universe. The stars were right, and where the perfect, terrifying black of the terminus had been, there was now a faint, shimmering scar in space-time, a distorted, nebula-like ripple where an impossibility had once resided. The wound was healing. The journey home was long and quiet. They did not speak of what had happened. There were no words for it. They were the only 3 human beings to have ever stepped inside an idea and fought their way out. The experience had marked them. Eris would forever carry an echo of that vast, lonely consciousness in his mind. Jin now saw the universe not as matter, but as a complex, elegant system of information. A schematic she could almost, but not quite, read. And Rostova, when she stood on the bridge and looked out at the stars, felt a profound and unending appreciation for the simple, beautiful, and chaotic noise of existence. When they were finally debriefed, their story was classified, buried under layers of disbelief and bureaucratic fear. But one piece of data from the Stelliform's final sensor logs could not be explained or erased. Amidst the terabytes of garbled noise from the Sieve's final moments, there was a single, isolated data packet. It was infinitesimally small, just a few bytes long, and encoded in a syntax that defied every known language, human or alien. It was clean, perfect, and utterly untranslatable. It was the entity's last word, not a threat, not a question, but a statement, a period at the end of a sentence they could not read, a final, silent piece of data that now existed inside their reality, a souvenir from the edge of everything